So good evening, everyone. Welcome to lecture number 2. And before we start, are there any questions from last week? No questions? Oh, no, okay, everything is very clear. That's very good. Okay, so we'll get straight into this week's lecture. And this week, or today, this evening, I want to talk about the 3 aims of Zen. So what are the 3 aims of Zen? Again, I would like to share a screen with you. Here it is. Okay, so the first aim of Zen is called Joriki. Joriki is a Japanese term. The term is also known in the Pali language called Samadhi Bala. And basically what it means is the power of concentration. So quite often, in some traditions, samadhi or concentration is seen as a primary aim. But here, one of the first aims of Zen is actually, what does actually concentration give us? What does it do? What is it actually that we're getting from concentration? And so that's what this refers to. So Joriki refers to the power, if you like, that meditation or concentration provides us with. And so you can look at it similar to physical exercise, going to the gym. We go to the gym in order to maybe get some muscle tone. But what does that actually do? It means that we can exercise and we can lift more weights. So we might start off with 5 weights, but if we keep on persistent, eventually we can actually lift maybe 10 kilos or 15 kilos or 20 kilos, and so it goes. So the power of concentration refers to that. What does it actually provide us with? So in order to get that power of concentration, if you like, we need to concentrate. We need to practice concentration, or we need to practice meditation. And so I want to just go over the various technical terms that some of you may be familiar with, and scan through them and survey them and see how they relate to Zen. So first of all, the power of concentration refers to a mental unification through the elimination of what's called unwholesome mental states or hindrances. And classically, the hindrances are sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, which is dullness, sleepiness, and heaviness, restlessness, worry, and doubt. So we will talk in much more detail about those hindrances. There's a whole section in the lessons next week about that. So once we eliminated those hindrances, so when you think about sitting on the cushion, what is it that provides you from having what we would normally call a good sit or a good meditation? Are hindrances that come up. So getting rid of those hindrances, somehow addressing them through certain antidotes, which we'll talk about next week, provides us then eventually with an ability to sit calmly. The term meditation is a Western term, or cultivation or practice. So quite often in Zen we refer to it as practice. And practice is not just meditation. When we talk in Zen about practice, practice includes all the techniques, if you like. It includes our whole engagement with Zen. But bhavana is again another term, which is probably the closest one that is linked to meditation. It's actually not used very much. Not many people know that term. But if you like, it's an umbrella term, just like meditation is. So when we say we meditate, what does that actually mean? And traditionally, meditation is seen very specifically categorized into different elements. And you may have heard of the term samatha, certainly in the Tibetan tradition, that's a term that is often used. Same in the Theravadan tradition. In Zen, actually, we don't use that term very much. It's again another Pali and also a Sanskrit term. And it means calm abiding, serenity, tranquility, and also the term samadhi, concentration. And quite often they are sort of lumped together. But in order to achieve calm abiding, samatha, or serenity or tranquility, we need to be able to concentrate. So again, when using that example of sitting on the cushion, if we're sitting off the cushion and we have the intention of being calm, serene, or tranquil, we have an object of meditation, which in Zen is counting, as we've discussed last week. And you'd think that all of a sudden calm abiding just happens, but it doesn't. So we sit down and we experience anything but calm abiding. All sorts of things come up. We might get angry. We might feel restless, and again, these are classically called the hindrances as well. So calm abiding, serenity, and tranquility is a goal, but quite often we don't experience it straight away, and there are many reasons for that. One is because we haven't cultivated meditation, or we haven't cultivated our concentration practice. In other words, we're not good at it yet. We start off doing it, but it takes time. We need to practice it. We need to cultivate it. And the other thing is that quite often when we sit down, things don't align. We have a body, we have emotions, we have perceptions, we have a mind state, we have memories, and they don't align with our intention to be calm. So it's a little bit the example that I've heard used quite often, which I like very much. It's a little bit like a car with four wheels, and each wheel goes into a different direction. And that is quite often what happens when we sit down. We sit down and every wheel goes into a different direction. Even though the intention is there with our object of meditation to be calm, but if an emotion arises because of a thought, because of a memory, or whatever that may be, we can't just automatically align them. So in many ways, calm abiding is the aligning of all these different faculties, if you like, of all our different states into a unified way. It's also referred to as absorption. You may have heard that term, meditative absorption. And here, what that refers to is that we are melting into the object of meditation. So when we are counting, and when we are able to really just count, nothing else but count, or nothing else but awareness of the breath, then we are melting into that object of meditation. And what that refers to is that all the other aspects, especially, and we call them quite often the subject, like me being the subject, our self-centeredness, if you like, falls away. And if I can achieve that, then I am starting to absorb or melt into the object of meditation. Composure is another word. We may have most of us would have heard of the term vipassana, meaning insight, and also mindfulness, and the Pali word for that is sati. So when you look at this little drawing here, so you see meditation up the top, bhavana up the top, and you see an arrow going down towards concentration, and you have another arrow towards mindfulness. Okay, so meditation classically includes these two elements, concentration and mindfulness. Now, mindfulness also has different applications, but just briefly, what is mindfulness? Without getting into too much detail about it, basically, mindfulness can be seen as, and to give you an analogy, when you are driving a car, you need concentration in order to stay between the white lines. If you are diverting away from the white lines as you are driving, you need mindfulness to be aware. And quite often, mindfulness is also translated as awareness, although technically there are differences. But you need to be mindful that you are now, if you like, wearing away from being in between those two white lines. So mindfulness is a crucial component, because if you are not mindful, then you're going into another lane, and now you've forgotten about concentration, being in the white line, being between the white lines, and an accident can happen. And in our meditation practice, it's the same thing. We have an object of meditation, which is concentration. We are concentrating on counting, but then we become aware when we are not counting. That's where mindfulness comes in. And there again, there's different degrees, whether that mindfulness needs to be looked at with with a very concentrated attention, or whether you can, whether you have enough mindfulness where you can just basically, where you can very loosely see it. In other words, you can sit very calmly, a thought comes up, you can see that, oh, here's a thought, and you can put more emphasis on the counting rather than the thinking. So in that case, your mindfulness is pretty sharp, in the sense that you do not allow the thought to dominate. You always allow the object of meditation to be at the forefront of your practice. So that's how mindfulness works. In Zen, um, mindfulness and concentration is a unified practice, and we cannot but practice those two together. So I am sitting on the cushion, I'm counting, or I have another object of meditation, and all of a sudden I get distracted, mindfulness kicks in, and I come back to concentration. So it's like a pendulum. Concentration, I get distracted, mindfulness comes in, it puts me back to concentration, I get distracted, mindfulness, and it goes backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. That is how it happens. In some other traditions, mindfulness is actually practice in itself, especially in the Theravadan tradition. Most of you might be familiar with the four foundations of mindfulness. There's a whole sutra on it, and that goes into being mindful, for instance, of the object of meditation might be your body, or as what is often referred to as a body scan. So your object of concentration might be your body, and then your mindfulness is holding your attention there, and it gets then into more of an analytical aspect of meditation. In Zen, we don't practice it like that. So mindfulness is both. It's a mind mapping tool and an awareness tool. So with mindfulness, we can get great insights into our mind, as in when certain emotions arise or when certain aspects arise, which lead to insight, to see things as they are versus conceptual overlays. You know, that can be used as a tool like that, or an awareness tool. In other words, an overall alertness versus as an analytical function, if that makes sense. So the overall alertness is like you just simply notice when you get interrupted, when a hindrance kicks in, and you notice that, and you know what to do in that case, which is primarily to let go of that hindrance or to put more attention on your object of meditation versus the hindrance itself. So if you like, mindfulness from a Zen perspective, serves as a gatekeeper to monitor our practice. That's how that works. The other term that is quite often used is Zazen. So quite often in Zen we say, okay, Zazen is a term which really means sitting meditation or seated meditation. Zazen can be object-based or objectless. Remember last week we talked about object-based meditation, meaning that we have an object and we use counting or mu. I'll talk about mu almost as a mantra, if you like, or as a keyword that'll come up in a later section. I'll go into more detail about that. But basically, object-based meditation would be Zazen, or objectless. Eventually, we drop the object of meditation, and it's like it's like counting without the counting. It's the same. Essentially the practice is the same, but we do no longer need an anchor. We just sit. So that's called shikantaza, or just sitting. And it's also called bare awareness. But to get to that point of being able to sit with bare awareness, we need to have some capacity, if you like, to be able to concentrate in order to do that. And so we start off with an object object-based meditation. It makes it easier. We've got that anchor, and eventually, for most people, the objectless part just kicks in naturally. So we might find even within a sit that all of a sudden the counting stops and we just sit, and our consciousness just falls where it falls, but we are able to register whatever is happening without getting involved in a story about it, and without getting involved in an objective as well. More difficult to practice, but that somehow that practice somehow emerges after we have built up good capacity to concentrate, if that makes sense. So again, you could say that that is meditation, if you like. Zazen, there are different terms here. Zazen, of course, is a Japanese term. The other one as a Pali. So it gets a little bit confusing, but I'll put these terms out there so that you can get a little bit of a reference point in regards to these terms. But we try and use English terms, but the English terms don't always nail it. They're not always specific enough. So then we refer back to sometimes to foreign terms as well. And of course, the practice is designed to promote a non-discriminatory awareness, and that is the, if you like, that is the objective. So that's just talking a little bit more about the different aspects. So all of that, if you like, all of that. Why are we doing that? Is to build up Joriki. And Joriki, the power of concentration, I should say, is also, it accumulates. So if we start sitting, that power accumulates. It's like if you go to the gym, you become stronger. There's a certain power that we get when we become stronger. We have the power to lift something we couldn't lift before, or we have the power to endure a marathon that we couldn't endure before, or to run longer, and so forth. So it's the same with meditation. As we keep on practicing, we are establishing a mind fitness, if I can use that term. We are becoming fit, mentally fit, if you like. And the other thing is we are sowing, if you like, we're sowing seeds, or we are preparing a field as we are doing that for something else to emerge, which is the second aim of Zen, which I'm talking about in a minute, the second aim of Zen. So that engaging in non-discrimination and being in that space where we don't discriminate, that allows room for us to perceive something different that we haven't been able to perceive before, because we're so engaged in our logic dualistic way of framing everything. So by gaining this Joriki, we are able to sort of access a completely different perspectives that we have not accessed before. Okay, before I go to the next screen, I'll just stop sharing that and see if there are any questions. All so clear, is it? Sure, you got, sorry?
Arno, can you explain Mu again? I think
You missed it. Okay, I haven't actually explained it yet.
Okay.
Mu, you can look at it as a mantra, but it's actually a koan and a mantra, if you like. Even though technically Zen does not refer to it as a mantra, it refers to it as a key word. It's basically something that we repeat over and over. But I will explain that in more detail. I won't do it just briefly here. I'll explain it in more detail in another lecture. I think it might be next week, where we go into much more detail about that, because it relates to koans.
Cool.
If that's okay. Any other questions? Okay. Now it's so the second aim of Zen, okay, for that to happen, okay, Joriki is an ingredient, if you like, that allows, if you like, we are preparing a ground for the next aim of Zen to appear, and Joriki is one way that we do that through. Okay, I'll just share another screen now. Okay, so the second aim of Zen is a Kensho experience. So Kensho experience is it's a Japanese term, Kensho, and it basically means seeing your true self. Okay. Another way of looking at it, you could say it's a perspective that breaks the barrier of dualism that we normally view the world through. Okay. Another way of looking at it, or another term that is often used, is an awakening experience as well. That's another way. Although awakening experiences and enlightenment experiences, those terms are so loaded nowadays that I'm almost reluctant to use them because we immediately feel like it's something that is not attainable, where that is not the case. So I want to get more into that. So that's why I personally prefer to use more modern terms. So the first thing I want you to do is have a look at the picture on the screen, and the picture there in the center of the screen. So I want to ask and maybe spend a little bit of time on seeing if you can see, if you can keep your hands up if you can see a duck. Can you see a duck? Okay. Now, who else can see a duck? Keep your hands up. Okay. Donna, can you see the duck? Okay, you can see the duck as well. Okay, I think that's got everyone here.
I see
now
something different.
Sorry?
I see a duck and something different.
Yes. So the next question is, who can see a rabbit? You can see a rabbit. Okay, I just have to change the screen here. And again, you can all see a rabbit. Clint, you can see a rabbit as well. Okay, very good. And I can see Caitlin nodding. Okay, so I presume everyone. It doesn't matter if you can't see it. Take your time. Eventually, it'll come through. So the idea here with this particular picture is it's only a simile. In other words, it's not that significant, but it shows you, it gives you an idea of what is meant by having a Kensho experience. So the idea is, normally when we go about our day-to-day business, from the time we wake up to the time we go to bed, we start thinking and we start discriminating. In other words, we're viewing our surroundings and we're viewing our world through this thinking process. And we can't even imagine viewing it any other way. I mean, how could you see it any other way? So and that is quite often called a paradigm. In academia they use that word paradigm a lot, but in this case it actually fits quite well. So we have this paradigm that we inhabit, and it's very difficult to get out of it. We see everything through. If we see a duck, well, a duck is a duck, and a table is a table, and cold is cold, and hot is hot, and we have this. We need a contrast, and that contrast can be labels or images or symbols, not only to communicate, but also in order to construct concepts, in order to function. That is our day-to-day, if you like, world through which we function in society. So in this case, I'm just giving it a few names. You may be familiar with some of these names. So we see a duck very clearly. There's a duck versus maybe a dog or versus a rabbit. We see duality. We see everything from a dualistic perspective. So in other words, we see form. So when here I am and I'm a certain form, I've got a certain body and I look a certain way. I look in a mirror and I see form, and I look around me and I see form everywhere. Everywhere's form. I've got a table, a computer. I see different faces. So I see form. Okay. I see it in a relative way, meaning that everything is relative to something else. The computer is different to a glass of water. It's relative. And that relativity is very important, again, from a point of view of discriminating, and also from a point of view of even communication. Conventional. Now, conventional here meaning that we use conventions. So in other words, here I use a convention of English in order to give this lecture, because we all agree in Australia we speak English. So that is the convention in Australia, is to use English. If I were in France, I would speak French, and the convention would be French. The convention here in Australia is metrics, whereas in the States it's imperial. The convention in Australia might be to say thank you and be much more polite, say maybe than the Germans are. So there are different conventions from a social aspect. There are different conventions in academia as far as citations are concerned. Do I use this citation convention or another citation convention? There's all sorts of convention, and without agreeing on those conventions, even spelling, without agreeing on them, or definitions, these are all conventions, it's very difficult to agree on anything, and it's very difficult to move forward. So we're sort of locked into this conventional way of looking at the world. Now, the next term is mundane. Mundane is a technical Buddhist term. It's the mundane world. So we are looking at things, the Buddhists would call it, from a mundane perspective. Okay. The other one is self another. In other words, self as in subject, other object. And I look at the world from my perspective, for where I am standing, which usually, and we touched on that last week, which usually includes a sense of self that I have. That sense of self can be functional, dysfunctional, or somewhere in between. It can be wholesome, unwholesome. It can be whichever way I label it, it can be like that. And I look at other people or even other objects, but always from my sense, the I perspective is very strong from this perspective. In fact, even just language, just using the English language, for instance, it's probably much stronger in the English language than in other languages. The word I or me is not used as much in other languages as it is in English. I was, for instance, always told in a letter when I grew up in Germany, you never use the word I. You always somehow try and frame a letter without using the word I. That was another convention, and it's very difficult to do that in English. If you try and write an essay or a letter without the word I, it's not easy. Okay, so that's just self another. Conditioned. Everything is conditioned. We all know about conditioning. Even this piece of paper here is conditioned. It's in itself. It doesn't exist, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But it needed certain aspects. It needed water for a tree to grow. It needed seed. It needed wood. It needed oxygen. It needed someone to cut a tree. It needed transport to get it to a mill. It needed machinery. There are so many things that it needed in order for this paper to arise, and that is what is meant by conditioned. So everything we see is somehow conditioned, including myself. I am conditioned based on the food that I eat, based on my DNA, based on how I grew up, my education, many aspects like that. So that's another that frames that view as well. Remember, we're talking about that dualistic way, the perspective of the duck. And of course, in Buddhism, that world is called samsara. So samsara, if you like, is the cycle of life. And samsara is that world that we inhabit that goes around and around and around. And that world is sort of defined like that. Now, the second aim, coming back to the second aim of Zen, is somehow to get another perspective that is beyond, if you like, that sense of self. And that is what is called a Kensho experience. When we have a Kensho experience, and that Kensho experience doesn't always come on the cushion, it can happen at any moment, then all of a sudden we have got a radical shift happening of perspective. A different perspective emerges. Okay. And all of a sudden we see a rabbit. That doesn't mean the duck isn't there. The duck is still there. See, if you look at that picture, there's one picture. Two sides of one coin. All of a sudden, we just have another perspective. We still have the dualistic perspective. We cannot get away with it. We couldn't communicate without it. But all of a sudden, we get a glimpse into another way of looking at things. Okay? And that is what is also referred to as breaking the barrier of dualism. So instead of all of a sudden being fixated on a duck, we all of a sudden see a rabbit. Hang on a second. If I look at that picture, most people, and this is quite challenging for some people. Most people would see that as a contradiction. It's either a duck or a rabbit. Which one is it? It can't be both. That's our dualistic way of looking at it. But here, all of a sudden, it's both. It's a duck and a rabbit. So in one way it doesn't make sense, but in another way, there it is. So all of a sudden, instead of duality, duck and rabbit, we have unity. It's a duck and a rabbit. It's one picture, duck and a rabbit. There's unity. But in a way, it does. And this is not easy to get our head around. Form, and on the other side of it is called emptiness, meaning that the form is no longer form. In other words, a duck is no longer a duck. There's something else there. And so in Buddhism, that term emptiness has come up. I'll talk more about emptiness later. We can get very much into metaphysics here, but I don't want to muddy the waters too much at this stage. Relative absolute is another term. So all of a sudden we see another perspective. We see things from an absolute, not just a relative point of view. Seeing things as they are, meaning that is quite often a term that is used, means seeing very clearly as they are, not just from that one dualistic perspective. Conventional, then it's used unconventional. Okay, so the other side is unconventional. Then we have mundane, supramundane. So if it's for those of you that study Buddhist sutras, that term comes up quite often. By the way, another one that I haven't gotten here, Aryan comes up, or noble. If someone says like the Four Noble Truths, or a noble one is someone that can see from that perspective. So that's where that term comes from. Okay. Self another, all of a sudden, there is no, actually that should be non-self. There's a mistake here. I have to correct that. That should be non-self. So we go self another and then non-self. Okay. I'll talk about that in the next slide about non-self. Conditioned and unconditioned. Now this is interesting. And by the way, in classical Buddhism, the only thing that is unconditioned in the entire universe from a Buddhist perspective is nirvana. It's the only thing that is unconditioned. So you got samsara and then you got nirvana. Okay. So being able to have a Kensho experience is like in Zen, that is foundational. Without that experience, it's like we don't really get it. It's all theory, and we're stuck at looking at the whole of Buddhism from this dualistic perspective. So unless we get this glimpse of the rabbit, or this glimpse of unity, or this glimpse of emptiness, unless we get a taste for that, and I mean an experience of that, it's all theory. It's all theory. So the second aim, so the first aim, Joriki, which gives us that the development of, or we're sowing the seeds, if you like, for a Kensho experience to happen. The second aim of Zen is this Kensho experience. Okay, so I now got this. I now go to another slide, but before I go to the other slide, let me just see if I have any questions. If I get any questions. Yes.
When you mentioned samsara being the cycle of life, in Zen does that the rebirth? Does that include it in samsara?
Yes. Zen. It depends on where you are. In Zen does not teach about rebirth itself. Not as a belief system. You really need to work on experiencing whatever you're experiencing through meditation, and if that includes some insights into, like in Buddhism, some people have meditated and have had insights into previous lives, as I mentioned last week. Unless you have experienced that and validated that for yourself experientially, so you've got empirical evidence, it's not talked about. It's like you need to really, but of course in Buddhism it's taught, and people believe it as a belief system, and it's got many advantages believing in that, because for all sorts of reasons, and we'll talk more about that also next week when we talk more about ethics. Sorry,
I know in Tibetan Buddhism they talk about it a lot.
Yes, they do.
About karma and rebirth, and the I can't remember now, but the consequences of your actions, and therefore your actions should be positive and pure and all that kind of
Yes, yes. That that is not taught like that in Zen at all. Next week I will be touching on ethics and morality and how in Zen we deal with that. A little bit different than a little bit different than in the Tibetan Buddhism, but it all comes together. It all feeds into it. But coming back to rebirth, a very easy way of looking at rebirth is, of course, everything is rebirth. I
yes.
mean, this here is rebirth.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a tree. This was a tree.
Yeah.
There was water involved in that tree. There's sunshine. The minerals. Where do the minerals come from? Dead matter. Topsoil is nothing but rebirth.
Yes.
Topsoil is nothing but rebirth. So if I look at myself, I am reborn every minute.
You change the change.
It changes. If I had some grapes for dessert, where are those grapes? They're right here. So that's another way of looking at rebirth. And of course, you when you look at the different traditions of Buddhism, they also include cosmologies that they inherited from thousands of years ago, what people believed in those days. So it's up to you, which way you want to look at that. But purely from a Zen perspective, you really need to validate everything that has been that you read, or that someone says to you. You need to validate that yourself through your own experience, which is meditation. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you. Anyone else?
Oh, yeah. With those Kensho and awakening experiences, I mean, how typical is that, though, for people to experience that? And how long is it, again, is there an average time that people take before having some type of an awakening experience through meditation?
Yes. I can only speak from my own experience. And on my next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But, in our group, for instance, and we've only been going for 3 or 4 years now. This is Pathway Zen, and of course I came from another group. I would say all those people that have been diligently sitting with that group as lay people, not the new one that I've started 4 years ago, but most of them had a Kensho experience. And in our group, some of them had already a Kensho experience before they came to Zen, because Kensho is not unique to Buddhism. The experience itself is neutral of any religion or even of any method. It's just, Buddhism has a way of somehow providing access to that, and a way of articulating it, and providing some methodologies. But I would say, personally, I would say anyone that is healthy, I couldn't 100% say that everyone 100% gets it, but most people that put in some effort on a daily basis, even without being monastics, have a chance of getting a glimpse of it. And I explain the process of that in my next slide, how that works from then on, once you get that glimpse. Yeah.
And then the point afterwards is then to stabilize that experience?
Well, we would call it to clarify it.
Okay.
To clarify it, yes, to continue. That is what we refer to as wisdom practice, where you keep on going with it. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Daniel. Good question. Anyone else?
Can I just add Daniel's question as well? Like you said, with the obviously consistent practice, you meditating. Is it also true that you could have the Kensho experience? No, I'm not wording this properly, but the more you let go of the left hand side, you had the duck, the duality bit, and I think maybe self-ego comes into that list as well. The more you let go of that aspect of you, the identity, the ego,
yes,
the quicker you can get to Kensho. I don't know.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, because in a way, and it's a good point, because when you are sitting, what are we letting go of? We are letting go of form, we're letting go of I, we're letting go of me, primarily me as the subject, me as the driver of relativity, of dualism, of that is definitely that is the practice. So the practice of letting go is directly linked to be able to open up to that experience. Yes. And hopefully the next slide will make it a little bit clearer again. Any other questions?
Arno, just
Yes.
one comment. When I started meditating without any framework or any sort of guide or anything, I was in a bit of a crisis, and getting rid of that thing and having a Kensho experience was just over 12 months for me, and it was very, very clear and very, very easy to spot in my life that something had changed. And so I certainly back up that if anybody who applies themselves, daily practice, I'm sure there'll be a result.
Yep, interesting. And for some people, I must say I get jealous of people that have constant Kensho experience, and there are people like that. Believe me, I met a lady the other day, and she had her first experience when she was 12, and she just keeps going with them. It sort of feeds on itself as well, like wisdom begets wisdom, if you like. And some people are living in that, and she didn't even know that she had that when she first started. She didn't know what it was. Eventually she came to Buddhism, and then all of a sudden it made all sense to her, because all of a sudden she had a point of reference. And so yes, so thank you for sharing that, Miles. Okay, I'll get the next screen. Again, it's a little bit heavy, but hopefully that'll clarify what I'm talking about again in a different way. Okay. Okay, so this particular screen here is called Second Aim of Zen, Seeing Your True Self. Okay. So here we have first of all, a horizontal line. So you've got a horizontal line. So this is just, again, an image. Please just see this as a metaphor, if you like, for something. So horizontal line is a nice way of looking at the way we perceive the world in a linear context. So we have a start and we have a finish. So we are born and we die. Very linear. And in between, things happen. So we have birthdays in between, we create families in between, we change jobs, we have highs and lows. And so this is basically the way we look at life. And we have an identity, and that identity may change depending on certain conditions. So we look at our life from this, if you like, from this linear horizontal perspective. Okay. We're also very much in this perspective, we are trapped, I'm using this term deliberately, by a sense of time and space. So it's very difficult for us to see beyond time, like to see beyond past, present, and future. And it's very difficult for us to see beyond space as well. And because of that, it somehow forces us to look at the world from that paradigm, from that perspective. And unless we have another experience which contradicts that horizontal way of looking at things, or this dualistic way of looking at that, we just don't think it's real. We cannot fathom it. We cannot see it. Okay, so that is what quite often is referred to as the self. Okay. By the way, when I say self here, these are Buddhist terms. Okay. So the Buddha, one of his first insights was that there is no self. Okay. So please don't confuse them with psychology and the sense of self and ego, Freudian ego, self function. It's got nothing to do with that. It's a different way of looking at this. Okay. So self also is really that idea that I look at the whole world from me, from my perspective. This here I am, and everything else around me, I look at from the perspective of me, because that is the only reference point that I have. I don't have any other reference points in regards to that. Okay, now I have a Kensho experience, and all of a sudden I see the world, if you like, from a vertical point, completely different. And so what happens now is I see the world that all of a sudden, instead of just seeing a a duck, I can see a rabbit. Okay. Instead of just seeing form, I can see beyond the form of this piece of paper. I can see that this piece of paper is also a tree. I can see that this piece of paper also is, if you like, is nothing other than an assembly, of components and an assembly of not only components but also of services. Like this piece of paper needed the hands of people in order to create this. And it needed a driver to drive this piece of paper from the mill or wherever it was produced to a store, and it needed a shop assistant. So there's all of this componentry or this assemblage, if you like, that is this piece of paper. Okay, so that is called non-paper. It's not that there is no paper; it's just non-paper. It's like, and when I see that as far as the self is concerned, the term that is used is non-self. Okay, so here, non-self should not be confused with no self. Okay, non-self meaning that self in itself is not something that can be defined. On its own, there are so many different components relating to that and interconnected to that. So one of the terms is non-self for that. And here again, what's important to notice is quite often, if non-self, you can look at it like you can look at it from an empirical, like non-self is like an empirical self versus a metaphysical self. A metaphysical self is an abstraction. Okay, and that, as far as Buddhism is concerned, and as far as a Kensho experience is concerned, is not existent. But of course, at the same time, there is an empirical self. We cannot lose that. In other words, empirical meaning a sensing self. The sensing that is happening is always there. But the construct of the self, that's what it's meant by non-self. There is no, that is just a construct that I have created about myself. Okay, so the term for that is non-self, and so we distinguish that with a capital S versus a lowercase s. So that's what non-self is concerned. And for that to happen, we need a Kensho experience. So when that Kensho experience happens, and by the way, before I go into that, I need to say something here. As I said before, the Kensho experience is not unique to Buddhism. Buddhism has formulated that. Buddha had an experience of that, and he related quite a few ideas to that, and those ideas became dogma. And so, whether it's the dogma of emptiness or dependent origination, they all relate to this somehow. So the coming back to non-self, that experience is visible, not just in Buddhism. If you look at the Christian tradition, for instance, and you look at all of the mystics, a lot of the mystics had that same experience. In fact, you could argue that even Jesus, he would have had some sort of an experience like a Kensho experience, as we name it in Zen, in order to come up with his ideas. If you look at Aboriginal culture, what is often referred to as dream time, can also be seen as an experience that we would classify as Kensho. So what I'm trying to say is that it is not proprietary. This is not something. It's not a method. This is something that is available to all human beings, and has been categorized in various ways through various forms, and it has been articulated in a context that is different, depending on the religion or the context that we live in. So Jesus has articulated it in a context of Judaism in Israel 2,000 years ago. An Aboriginal has articulated that experience through their cultural through their cultural means and the way they view through their worldview, if you like. And it's the same with Buddhism. Buddhism has articulated that experience as well in a context that was unique 2,500 years ago, if you like, and so you can look at it that way. So first of all, the self, coming back to that, if you read that top line, the different perspectives. And by the way, they are just perspectives. Please keep that in mind. These are different perspectives that we inhabit. The self, the horizontal line, shows itself through a worldview framed within a transactional, everything is transactional in our context, relative and dualistic time and space bound paradigm. So that's how most of us look at it. That's how we look at the self. All of a sudden we have a Kensho experience. It shows itself in a form of a breakthrough. So most people, that if they have a Kensho experience, you'll know about it when you have one. There is a breakthrough. There is a shift that happens. Okay. For those that watched that bike example, okay, with that upside down bike, it's a little bit like that. It's like all of a sudden the mind goes click, and it just shifts, and all of a sudden you see it. You know, with the bike, the same thing happened. It was almost impossible until there was that shift in the mind, and then all of a sudden everything fell into place. You know, and that's why that is quite a nice image, that bike video that I sent you, just to show you that the mind somehow clicks into place when that happens. We can't will it. It just, after much practice, it just happens. Some people have had that experience naturally, without even meditating. So we don't know. No one knows exactly what is required for it to happen in a complete 100% sense. Certainly the Buddhists and the Buddha has meditated, and meditation has become a tool and a pathway, if you like, for it to happen, and it has proven over and over again that works. But you know, there are other ways as well. And we don't know of all of the ways, of course. Prayer may be another one. Devotion may be another one. But they are different. We don't know exactly what the ins and outs are of that. So it shows of self, this no self, or non-self, sorry, shows, again, I should have put down non-self instead of no self. This non-self shows itself in the form of a breakthrough or a awareness shift of duality. It can be symbolized through archetypes, and that is what we often do. So as soon as we have an experience, we instantly start labeling it and framing it within the context that we live in. So if I'm a Christian, I might say, wow, God just spoke to me, or God has given me a sign. Or so that's my context because I'm a Christian. Or if I believe in Jesus, it might be Jesus. If I'm an Aborigine, I might refer to my ancestors or my totem or something else. So it shows itself, or it is symbolized through archetypes within conditioned frameworks of religion, cultural settings, of course, doesn't have to be religions. There could be deities, nature, spirits, all of these different traditions and paganism maybe. They all point to that same, if you like, that same experience, but each one articulates it differently. And of course, we might look at it and say, "Oh, that can't be right," or "This can't be right." But then what happens quite often is that people start believing in the articulation or in the symbolism rather than getting back to the source of it all. And so there's a danger there. When we start using symbolism, there is a little bit of a danger there that we get stuck with the symbolism, and then we are starting to put overlays on that experience. It no longer stays pure, if you like. So again, can be symbolized through archetypes within conditioned frameworks of religions, cultural settings, including deity, nature, spirits, totems, angels, gods, Buddhas, heaven, dreamtime, bodhisattvas, arahants. There are so many words that humanity has come up with as archetypes, if you like, but underlying those archetypes usually is an experience, even though that may have long been forgotten, that particular experience. So that's one way that it shows itself. The next way that it shows itself, and this is the Zen way, if I can suggest that, is that it shows itself within an unconditioned perspective. So Zen is very strong here. Zen rejects all symbolism, okay, in that sense. So where we are able to give up all symbols, okay, that doesn't mean we can't have symbols, you know, but we see through them, and we continuously practice, you know, letting go of it. You know, we need symbols to survive. There's no doubt about it. So in other words, we don't throw everything away, because then we would live in total isolation of it. So we need symbols in a way, but we are continuously practicing a letting go of. So, and we're letting go of images and conventions as well. We're seeing things as they are, as a fact, as an absolute pure fact, okay, which is not easy. If I say, what is the fact of this stick? It's a very difficult question. Now, I can put a scientific head on and start analyzing what this stick is scientifically, but that does not show me the fact. What really is the fact is the question that is always asked, you know, and that refers back to that experience of seeing things as they truly are, you know. And in this case, logic, you know, fails us, because logic is limited, because logic is limited to the duck perspective. It is limited to that reference point that we have. We are, in a way, we are limited to by our own definitions. We cannot go beyond those definitions, you know. So that is why it's called a transpersonal perspective. It goes beyond those definitions, you know. And in many ways, words fail us, but of course we already have words to communicate. So Zen has developed methods in order to cultivate, if you like, in order to cultivate this perspective. And these methods are koans, but I'll talk more about the koans at a later stage. Okay, so this is now this non-self. Okay, so by the way, for those of you that know a little bit about Buddhism, this is also, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, what they refer to as the two truths. You know, there's the conventional truth, you know, and there's the unconventional, or there's the relative and the absolute. So they are referred to as the two truths. Nagarjuna, famous philosopher, Tibetan Buddhism claim him as one of their own, and Zen claims Nagarjuna as one of their own. Many people claim Nagarjuna, and he came up with a whole school, basically. Articulating these two perspectives. Then a little bit later on, after Nagarjuna, came along another great sage called Vasubandhu, and he came up with a third truth, if you like, even though I don't like the word truth, but if you like. And the third one is really the integration of this. So in other words, if we have a Kensho experience, and we now all of a sudden have a reference point that goes beyond our dualism, what tends to happen is that we get stuck there. What tends to happen is that we create another dualism. We say, okay, this is one side and this is the other side. So we're creating another dualism. Or some people, and this is this classical Mahayana, Hinayana finger pointing, that's, you know, saying if you just keep on meditating and you cultivate your non-self perspective, you're no good to anyone. You're living in a cave, and you might get more and more insight, but what good is that? You know. So what Vasubandhu suggested is that we need to integrate this, you know? And he came up with this term true self, not a different term, a very technical term, but that's also referred to as true self. So true self is being able to see beyond ourself. In other words, see that there is actually no self there, in the sense of a metaphysical self, as being an identity that is completely constructed by ourselves, and then somehow integrate that. And the integration process is to come back into what we call the muddy waters. In other words, we need to somehow integrate that within the dualistic world that we live in day to day. So it's no good looking at the world from a duck's perspective. I need to see it from duck and rabbit perspective. I cannot let go of the I cannot let go of the duck. I need to be back in dualism because that's where we live. And how do I integrate those two? That is a journey. Okay, and that refers. Then I'll refer back to another slide here. By the way, next week you see this middle line here, which is really we're coming back from non-self down towards the self, and self. The idea is to come back or to go towards non-self, so that we create, if you like, the third perspective is where we integrate where we integrate non-self and self together. It becomes one reality, and which it is. Okay, that is actually seen in Zen as the hardest journey. So that process is the third aim in Zen. So first aim, Joriki. Second aim, Kensho experience. Without that experience, all of this actually doesn't make sense. Even the Buddhist teachings don't really make sense because we're only seeing it from one perspective. We might use them, of course, for all sorts of different purposes, therapeutic purposes, moralistic purposes. I mean, it's a great tradition as far as teaching morals, loving kindness, all that sort of thing. But the true essence of what Buddhism is really about, coming back to the awakening experience of Buddha being the origin of Buddhism, that can only be really attained once we have an experience like that. So the third aim is the integration, and here the third aim we call it in Zen the personalization or the personalizing the experience of Kensho, and I would go as far as saying personalizing Buddhism. Personalizing is not having knowledge of it. It is infused in our character. It needs to become our character. Our day-to-day action is completely infused in that integration. The other way you can look at that is wisdom practice. So koan work in many ways relates to that. I won't have time today to talk about koans. We'll talk about that next week. So that's also called a wisdom practice. And also, it's also called an awakening process. We may have had an experience or a glimpse of this non-duality. That doesn't mean we're enlightened or we're awakened. That is just another reference point that we've gained. So the awakening process starts. And one of the masters in our school, he said, while we may have realized non-self, emotions and delusions remain stubbornly rooted as ever. We can't just, even though we've had an experience like that, that doesn't mean all of a sudden we're perfect human beings. They remain rooted. Our karma is still there, if you like. Intensive practice that follows an awakening experience begins. So some people in Zen say it really only starts right then. So the process starts, and that is basically the journey. Okay, so I'll just close this slide here and ask if there's any questions. I can see. I know it's a bit heavy, but it's important to get hopefully a little bit of an overview of all of this. Yeah. Yes, Shalini, did you want to say something?
No. I'm just absorbing.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, just absorb. Actually, the Kensho experience, and maybe that quote. I didn't get the full. I wasn't able to write the full quote down in time, but the quote at the end you had for the third aim. So while we may have realized non-self, emotions and delusions remain
stubbornly rooted as ever.
So that means that you could have smaller Kensho experiences.
Yeah, so what happens normally is once we're on this journey, they keep rolling along the Kensho experiences. you get more and more insights. In the some Theravadan traditions refer to insights almost as psychological insights, but classically in Theravada, an insight is actually a Kensho experience as well. And a Kensho experience is a real shift that happens. I mean, the psychological insight is great, and we get many of those, of course, in our practice. But there is a difference. There is a difference.
Have there been situations where someone's just had an awakening fully, just everything's just gone?
Yes.
And they just
the Buddha is one example where depending on the degree of realization or depending on the degree of the Kensho experience, that can be extremely powerful. Where and I can only cite textual references like sutras, for instance, where all karma has been dissolved, if you like, through that experience. That's how strong it was. That's what the texts say. But I certainly have never seen that, and I haven't seen anyone that has had that like that. But yes, according to the text, that is possible.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Yes, Donna?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep, good. When you talk about personalizing the experience, is this something like where people can get a transformational experience? So from what they've had in their Kensho, is that then lead to something that's transformational in people?
Well, it definitely it transforms many things. There's no doubt. It can be in mildly, but it depends on what you call transformational. It's certainly a Kensho experience. You won't forget it. And for some people have had it and haven't done anything with it. In other words, it was good and haven't continued with the practice. So that has, and I know people like that. Have had experiences like that, but for whatever reason, this is not necessarily negative, or maybe they've gone in a different direction. I don't know. I've lost touch with people that have had it and then sort of went back into not cultivating it further. But generally, yes. Generally, from a very mild sense, it certainly everything becomes much easier in the sense that you're no longer attached to all those dualistic to that whole dualistic framing. That in itself is a huge one for a lot of people. So everything seems to be coming. It's transformational, even psychologically, for sure. Yeah. But it's not a. Next week we'll talk about ethics and how it also works in conjunction with ethics, and that from that perspective it is transformational as well. I'll talk about that a little bit more next week as well. Anyone else?
Okay, so just on that, so you're saying next week though you're talking about ethics as in like a framework of how to be a good person versus simply a practice that gives you insight into the true nature of reality.
Yes, so ethics is very important, as you can have this without ethics as well, and so that's a parallel practice, if you like, and because this Kensho experience is neutral. Some people would argue it leads to, and it does. There's no doubt in my mind that it does that, but there is a parallel practice, and how that relates to it, and how, and I'll explain that next week. How that connects and links together.
I think there's countless times when I think there's well-known gurus who have obviously had very genuine awakening experiences, but ultimately end up being very unethical people, right? So
that's exactly right. That happens all the time, and not just gurus. It happens in Buddhist traditions, and Zen, and everywhere, in every. So there is because having an experience like that, that can happen to anyone. You don't even have to be meditating. It's just that if you all of a sudden make that your intention and you want to follow that path and you're drawn towards that, certainly meditation is one way where you can cultivate a mind state that leads to it. But other people, they get it. Drugs is another one. I mean, there are many people that have take psychedelics and they have similar experiences. And I've spoken to a few, and when I compare, and of course a lot has been written about this as well. When you compare the experience, by all accounts, it's very similar. But that doesn't necessarily. But their ethics is not even. There's that whole ethical issue or that whole ethical dimension sort of frames, the practice as well. So that's next week.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. So can I suggest? Oh, sorry, Caitlin. Yes.
Oh, sorry. It's just
no, that's right.
Probably a very short, but kind of an extension of that as well. Where can a experience like that be quite like traumatic or shocking to the system, or is it something like you'll only ever get what you're ready for, or you'll never be delivered more than you can handle?
Yes, also a good question. I mean, I wouldn't say, it's not shocking from my own experience, but it is significant. And there can be laughter, there can be tears, there can be all sorts of things involved when you have an experience like that. But of course, and I said that in the first lecture, not everyone is ready for this. In a way, if you the process of letting go, sitting on the cushion and letting go, can be very scary for a lot of people, because quite often, as I said in the first lecture, what can happen is if your self-image is not it's not strong enough, if you like, then I would suggest you have to you have to take a little bit of caution. Or if you're because mental illnesses, there's even suggestions from some people that psychosis and Kensho is very closely linked, in the sense that your sense of self, if you like, needs to be strong enough that you can always come back to it. And in a Kensho experience, you do. In other words, if you all of a sudden see the rabbit, you don't lose the duck. Whereas in psychosis, you lose the duck. And if you lose the duck, then it's a problem. So there's a little bit of a bit of caution. It's not for everyone. Yes, yeah, because you are letting go. And that can be scary, for some people. And some people just relish it. They're ready. They just bring it on. So it's like that. Yeah.
Does dementia, the losing the duck, when you have dementia, is that what happens?
Oh, I got no idea. I wouldn't know. David might be able to, but that's a tricky one. I'm not sure. Yeah. Yeah. But it is, when people come and people that are in therapy, and a lot of people that are in therapy are drawn to this, by the way. A lot of people are drawn to this practice. Then they should really have a talk to their therapist about this and see whether they feel it's safe or not, and all of this, and have a talk it through. Yeah.